On the face of it, 2056 was a fairly uneventful year for the people of the United Canadian and American States. The insect spirit infestation in Chicago that had begun in 2055 was ongoing but effectively contained inside the Chicago containment zone, although at this point the public was still largely unaware as to the severity of the threat. In fact, the only real event of note that year was the presidential election of 2056, which saw incumbent President Thomas Steele and Vice President James Booth facing off against a menagerie of political opponents so unremarkable and boring that many UCAS voters would struggle to name just one contender. In fact, the only real event of note during the election was Congress unanimously approving citizenship for the Great Dragon Dunkelzahn on June 22nd. An event which, of course, Steele's campaign would use to its full advantage. Thomas Steele had risen to power in UCAS politics previously as the vice presidential candidate under the Democrat ticket, led by former President Allen Adams. President Adams had the distinction of serving his country for just a few weeks before his sudden death after winning the 2052 election. And then Vice President Steele became President Steele and appointed the Secretary of State James Booth as Vice President. Steele and Booth were running for re-election under the Technocratic Party ticket in 2056, and President Steele's campaign performed about as well as one would expect. Typically, incumbent presidents in the UCAS have an easier time running for re-election, and the Steele campaign was no exception. President Steele had also managed to use the Great Dragon's citizenship to his advantage on the campaign trail, with the handshake photo between himself and Dunkelzahn blanketing the airwaves during the otherwise uneventful summer campaign season. This would catapult his campaign to the top of the polls. Couple that with the fact that the early 2050s were relatively peaceful and prosperous for the UCAS, and it's no surprise that President Steele was able to coast to an easy victory in November. The scandal that would explode out of the 2056 election began as such things often do, with whispers and rumors from the shadows. All political contests come with mostly unfounded allegations and counter-accusations from opposing parties and the usual media suspects. Naturally, the 2056 was no exception. Mostly, though, the public and the media was content to see the end of another campaign season, and people paid the largely unfounded accusations of electoral shenanigans little heed. All of that would change in early 2057, however, with a blog post published on Matrix site known for covering Baltimore's decking scene. The post was a fairly typical one, covering some of the tales of the site's members' largely exaggerated exploits hacking various megacorporate and government nodes. Familiar names such as Fucci and the UCAS CIA were mentioned as targets, but one user also made mention of the infiltration of a secure node linked to an Ares electronics subsidiary. This company just happened to be one that was instrumental in administering the UCAS's remote vote system. What would normally be just a typical Decker brag session managed to pique the interest of a local investigative journalist who decided to dig just a little bit deeper into the Ares subsidiary. Now, the name of the investigator has been lost to history, but the evidence they uncovered was clear as day. The UCAS election system had been hacked, and President Thomas Steele had stolen the 2056 presidential election. Initially, the Steele campaign denied the obviously preposterous allegations of voter fraud. After all, hacking the electoral system of one of the most powerful nations in North America and a one-time superpower was surely impossible. Eventually, however, more and more people started digging. Cracks in the Steele campaign story began to appear, and more mainstream outlets joined in on the investigation, which lent more credence to the accusations of voter fraud. The major networks followed their noses and their ratings, and the allegations against the Steele campaign flooded the airwaves. President Steele, for his part, was determined to fight back against the allegations. Campaign staffers issued denials and counter-accusations against their accusers. Old skeletons were drug out of numerous closets of the political elites, and the Washington, D.C. shadows became a very busy place indeed. Bought and paid for experts testified as to the impossibility of rigging a presidential election, and President Steele himself gave a live Trid interview where he vehemently denied rigging the 2056 election. In fact, President Steele acquitted himself so well during the interview that it became one of the highest-rated non-sports programs of the last 10 years. It actually looked like President Steele was on the verge of beating the scandal, until disaster struck. Political scandals frequently reach a critical mass where the accusations being lobbed simply cannot be denied. For President Steele, the smoking gun came when a series of emails were leaked to every major news outlet all at once. Where these emails came from is unknown, and no one has claimed responsibility for the leak to this day. The evidence within the emails, however, was damning in the extreme. President Steele was shown discussing the intrusion of the Ares subsidiary leading up to the hack, as well as belittling and insulting the media investigators looking into the scandal. Perhaps the most damning of all, President Steele consistently referred to when he would win the election, not if he would win the election. The memos showed President Steele to be an arrogant, spiteful man who had masterminded the most heinous case of electoral fraud in UCAS history. Congress immediately launched an official investigation into the evidence contained within these emails. Soon after that, they began impeachment proceedings against President Steele and Vice President Booth and convicted the pair of rigging the 2056 election. President Steele and Vice President Booth were removed from office a mere 3 months after Steele's landmark interview. Speaker of the House Betty Jo Pritchard found herself as the first female president of the UCAS by default. But rather than consolidate her power, President Pritchard declared a special election to be held later in 2057, thus setting the stage for one of the strangest, most intense, and most influential political seasons in UCAS history. And that's the chip truth, chummers. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more Shadowrun content. Hit that notification bell so you will always know when I upload a brand new Shadowrun video, and until next time, remember to shoot straight and never, ever deal with a dragon.